There is something about the quiet of the night that makes certain stories feel heavier, as if the stillness itself wants to hold on to them. This is one of those stories. It begins with silence, with a lonely patch of woods, and with a cardboard box that should have been nothing more than forgotten trash. Instead, inside that box was a mystery that would trouble investigators, the city of Philadelphia, and eventually the entire country for more than 60 years. It was the cold winter of 1957. The streets of Philadelphia were lined with frost, and out in the northeastern part of the city, near a quiet stretch of Susquehanna Road, the air was still. Trees were bare, their branches like black lines against the gray sky. The kind of chill that settles into bone hung low that week, and the ground was stiff, brittle underfoot. To most, it was just another ordinary evening in the post-war city, where factories hummed during the day and homes glowed warm at night. Families prepared dinner, radios played softly, and children finished homework before bed. But in the trees along that lonely road, something waited to be found. The discovery came not from a police officer, not from a hiker, but from an ordinary young man out checking the area. He had gone there for something entirely unrelated, something simple, the kind of errand that would normally be forgotten by nightfall. Instead, what he stumbled across would forever mark him as the one who first laid eyes on the box. The box itself was ordinary at a glance. A cardboard carton, the kind once used to hold a bassinet, now discarded on the ground, its edges softened from dampness and weather. But inside was no leftover piece of furniture. Inside lay the small, fragile body of a boy. He was naked, wrapped in a plain blanket, his tiny limbs drawn in against the cold, as if sleep had caught him at the worst possible moment. His hair had been crudely cut, unevenly chopped as though by clumsy or hurried hands. His skin bore marks, bruises, the silent record of pain and neglect. The boy was estimated to be around 4 to 6 years old. His eyes were closed. His expression was quiet, almost peaceful if not for the tragedy of the setting. Alone in the woods, in a box meant for something meant to comfort and protect, he had instead been abandoned without even the dignity of clothes or a name. The young man who discovered him was shaken. At first, he hesitated, uncertain of what he had stumbled upon. People in the area were not used to finding abandoned animals, trash, or discarded items along the road. But as realization spread, he understood that this was no stray, no refuse. This was a child. He quickly notified the authorities, and soon the stillness of that cold patch of woods would be broken by footsteps, voices, and the grim presence of police officers trying to make sense of what they were seeing. For the officers who arrived, the scene was haunting. The little boy lay so small, so defenseless, as if the world itself had failed him. The cardboard box, already damp, seemed an inadequate container for such a secret. The blanket was thin, doing little to shield him. Around them, the woods offered no clues, no immediate sign of who had placed him there or why. Just trees standing as mute witnesses, branches shifting slightly in the wind. News traveled quickly, even in that era. A boy in a box, found on a roadside. The phrase alone was enough to spark imagination, horror, and sympathy. But with the discovery came more questions than answers. Who was he? How had he come to be here? And why? In a city full of families, neighbors, and people who knew one another, had no one yet come forward to say they were missing a child. The mystery began here, in the frozen woods of Philadelphia, with the unnamed boy in the box. From this moment on, investigators would pour time, effort, and hope into uncovering his identity. But as the first day ended, all they had was a heartbreaking sight: a child with no name, a cardboard box, and silence pressing in from every side. The first officers arrived quickly. Headlights washed over the trees. Doors opened, boots pressed into the frozen ground. The quiet that had held the woods all morning gave way to the careful movements of men who understood, the moment they saw the box, that this was no ordinary call. They worked slowly. One officer marked the location of the cardboard carton. Another set a perimeter with simple, practical steps: rope, stakes, a firm voice asking onlookers to stand back. Someone fetched blankets from a cruiser and held them up as a shield from the road, not for evidence, but for dignity. Even before the city knew the story, those few in the trees felt the weight of it. The box itself had once held a bassinet, a simple, store-bought cradle for a newborn. The printing on the cardboard was still faintly visible despite weathering. The edges were softened by damp. Inside, the blanket around the child was plain and worn. Nothing expensive, nothing that wanted to be noticed. Detectives joined the patrolmen. They took notes in small, tight handwriting. They worked in pairs, trading glances the way veterans do when they've seen something that will be difficult to forget. Photographs were taken from every angle: the box, the ground, the nearby brush. They moved the boy with care, speaking in low tones to one another as they did. Back at the station, phones began to ring. A child found in a box. Along Susquehanna Road. No identificación. No immediate explanation. The words were simple, but they spread across desks and precincts with a kind of cold momentum. The autopsy followed as soon as it could. A medical examiner measured and weighed the boy. He was small for his age, malnourished. His ribs could be counted beneath the skin. His hair had been cut roughly and recently. Uneven, choppy, not the work of a careful barber. Some believed the cut might have been done after death because short clippings were found clinging to his body. Others argued it could have been done shortly before. Either way, it told a story of haste or of someone trying to change the way he looked. There were bruises, new ones, old ones, marks that suggested falls, blows, or rough handling over time. Scars too, small, neat lines that looked surgical. A mark near the groin that could indicate a treated hernia. Another at the ankle. A third beneath the chin. They were the kind of scars that should have matched a medical record somewhere, if anyone knew his name. His nails were trimmed clean. His body had been washed. Those details were unexpected, and they troubled the investigators. The neglect hinted at by malnourishment stood beside careful, recent grooming. Two truths in conflict. Two hands at work, one careless, one meticulous. The blanket was examined. It was simple and practical, worn from use. No labels remained. Investigators noted its weave and pattern and compared it against records from manufacturers. The results were suggestive, but not definitive. A blanket like this could have come from many places. It could have sat in many homes. The box offered a more concrete lead. Bassinet cartons like this weren't sold everywhere. The printing on the side could be traced to a regional distribution. Detectives followed the trail to local stores and warehouses, asking simple questions with heavy implications. How many of these boxes were shipped? How many sold? To whom? Receipts were checked. Employees were interviewed. A handful of purchasers were identified and confirmed. One or two boxes couldn't be accounted for with certainty. It was a thread, slender but a thread. Meanwhile, the boy's fingerprints and footprints were recorded. Photographs were taken carefully, including a series meant to show his features as they might have looked in life. In those days, detectives sometimes dressed a deceased child in a small shirt or draped cloth in a way that softened the starkness, not to sensationalize, but to help the public see a person rather than a statistic. They wanted someone, somewhere, to look at those eyes and say a name. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood near Susquehanna Road. Doorbells rang. Questions repeated. Had anyone seen a car pulled to the shoulder in recent nights? Had anyone noticed a person walking into the trees? Was there a sound out of place, a door slammed, a voice raised, a dog barking in the wrong hour? Most people had noticed nothing. A few remembered small things that might have been something, or might have been the ordinary noises of winter. Memory is like that. It tightens when asked to perform. They widen the circle. Hospitals were contacted. Any recent admissions for a small boy with bruising? Any records of surgeries that match those scars? Pediatric offices were asked to check their files. Orphanages and children's homes were contacted. The calls were made, the letters sent. The replies trickled back, stacks of no, unknown, and not here. In the lab, the blanket and box were examined again. Fibers were collected, dust and debris lifted. A few strands of hair recovered. Tiny fragments were preserved in envelopes and labeled with date, time, and place. This was 1957, before DNA testing, before national computer databases. Much of this evidence would have to wait decades to find its full voice, but it was saved against the day when science might come knocking with new questions. The medical examiner considered the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The blows were significant. There was no sign of sexual assault, no disease that might explain his condition. Malnourishment was clear enough. The timeline was estimated with the tools of the time. Likely he had been dead a short while before discovery, days rather than weeks. The cold had slowed everything, preserving and disguising at once. The face of the boy, anonymous, delicate, and impossibly young, went to print. Posters were created, handbills, flyers with the phrase that would stick for decades: the boy in the box. His features were clean and simple in the photograph. The eyes closed, the mouth slack with the unguarded openness of childhood. The image asked a question every time it was seen: who is he? Detectives went to barbershops. They asked about haircuts given to little boys in recent days or weeks. Not neat trims, rough cuts, something done in a hurry, perhaps at home. Some barbers remembered things that might fit: a child brought in with a bruise, a father who looked nervous, but nothing that could be tied to a name and address with certainty. They went to discount stores and churches. They asked parish staff about any new families in need. They checked with charity organizations for records of children placed, moved, or withdrawn. Undertakers, too, were asked if any small coffin had been purchased quickly, quietly, without a funeral. The answer was always the same: no, we're not sure, or we're sorry, but we can't help. A small cap was found in the wider search, a corduroy hat with a leather strap. It was recovered not far from where the box had been. The strap had been altered at a local shop. Detectives tracked the alteration to a hatter who recalled doing the work, perhaps for a man who had come in with a woman. The memory was not perfect. The description was thin. It was a lead with edges already fraying. Days turned into weeks. The boy still had no name. The police gave him one for their own use. Not a true name, but a nickname of respect, a way to speak about him as a person in the squad room. Reporters used "boy in the box" because newspapers speak in headlines. Detectives used other words in private, gentle ones. The city took ownership of the grief in small ways. Officers donated to pay for a simple funeral when the time came. A tiny coffin, a small plot, flowers laid by hands that had carried too many case files home at night. A priest spoke spare, direct words. The wind cut across the cemetery that day, and a handful of men stood with their hats in their hands and promised, out loud or silently, that they would not forget. Back in the file room, the case thickened. Leads were logged, tips pinned to a board. A map of the city and suburbs sprouted colored tacks and lengths of thread. The bassinet box was a hub, the blanket another, the cap a third. Every telephone tip was listened to. Every rumor was given at least a few steps of attention. Detective work is persistence stitched to patience. It is also humility. The willingness to admit that the thing you hoped would bloom into an answer is only a leaf on a long vine. The boy's teeth were examined. He was young, with baby teeth still in place. No obvious dental work, no records to match. In later years, odontologists would revisit the photographs and notes. But in 1957, there was little more to do than file the measurements and move to the next item. The press did its part. Articles ran with the boy's image. Radio spots asked the public to come forward. A hotline received calls, some heartfelt, some unhelpful, a few cruel. Detectives learned to listen for the ring that sounded different. The caller who began not with "I think," but with "I know." Those were rare. Most ended the same way: "Thank you for calling. We'll look into it. Goodbye." The case stretched into spring. Officers kept the photograph on their desks. The medical examiner's report sat in duplicate in a drawer. When new cases arrived, the boy's file was stacked beneath them and then lifted again as soon as time allowed. That is how an unsolved case lives. It breathes between emergencies. It waits, and the people who care about it keep it alive by refusing to set it aside for good. And always, the central fact remained: a small boy, a cardboard box from a store that sold bassinets, a blanket that belonged in a home. scars that should have matched a chart somewhere, a haircut that had been done in a hurry, a body washed, and nails trimmed by hands that might have meant care or concealment. The questions pressed in from every side. Had he been born in a hospital or at home? Had he been enrolled anywhere? A clinic, a church, a school? Had someone moved recently, leaving no forwarding address? Had a neighbor seen a child in a window one week and not the next? Someone knew him. Someone had held him, fed him, however poorly. Someone had watched him sleep. And yet no one came forward to say his name. The investigation would widen. It would span neighborhoods, counties, and eventually states. It would endure beyond the careers of the first men who stood in those winter trees. But in those first weeks, the work was simple, relentless, and without comfort. Ask, listen, write it down, check, and then ask again. The boy waited in the file. The city learned his story in headlines and whispers. And the detectives, facing the end of another long day, turned off their desk lamps one by one, leaving the photograph to rest in the half-light. A reminder that some mysteries begin not with a suspect, but with a child who should have had a name. As winter pressed on, the case of the boy in the box began to ripple outward, touching neighborhoods far from the quiet stretch of Susquehanna Road. Detectives kept to their methodical rhythm, retracing every possible step that might explain how a small child could end up abandoned in so lonely a place. Each morning began with coffee and a roll of updates, and each evening ended with more questions than answers. The canvassing became a ritual. Officers moved block by block, knocking on doors, repeating the same quiet words. A boy about 4 to 6 years old, found in a box, wrapped in a blanket. Had anyone noticed a child gone missing? Had a neighbor's window gone dark? A family vanished without a word? In some homes, residents listened carefully, brows furrowed as they tried to search their memories. Others shook their heads with a weary certainty. They had heard nothing, seen nothing. But sometimes a detail surfaced. A woman remembered hearing a car engine late at night, idling near the woods. A man recalled seeing headlights cutting through the trees where headlights did not belong. A boy delivering newspapers swore that one morning, weeks before, he had seen something strange in the brush, but had thought it was just trash tossed aside. All of these fragments were written down, cross-checked, pinned with color markers on the growing case map. None were enough. The box itself remained the most tangible lead. Detectives followed its trail with stubborn patience. It had once held a J.C. Penney bassinet, the kind sold in only a handful of stores in the region. They traced shipments, checked sales records, and painstakingly tracked down the customers who had purchased similar boxes. Some boxes had been discarded already. Others were still in basements or attics, filled with blankets, dolls, or household odds and ends. A few could not be accounted for. The receipt records faded or incomplete. Still, each possible path was followed, even when it ended in a locked door or an unhelpful shrug. The blanket received equal attention. Its pattern was ordinary but distinct, a simple weave, not widely manufactured. The FBI, consulted in the early days, attempted to trace the source, but the effort stalled. Blankets like this had been sold in multiple states, produced in quantities that blurred into anonymity. The trail ended in warehouses and records that could only narrow, never confirm. The investigators also questioned the neighborhood's children, often through their parents. Did anyone remember a classmate, a playmate, who had suddenly stopped appearing at school or on the block? It was a delicate task, for the questions stirred fear in mothers and fathers alike. To imagine a child vanishing, to imagine the possibility that such a fate could strike their own homes, was nearly unbearable. The answers were guarded, and though a few parents recalled families moving away quietly, none of the descriptions seemed to fit. As the weeks lengthened, the city newspapers carried the story again and again. Headlines screamed, "Who is the boy in the box?" Photographs of the child, dressed carefully in borrowed clothes for the post-mortem pictures, were printed alongside appeals for information. Some readers recoiled at the images, finding them unsettling. Others clipped the articles and saved them, convinced they might someday recognize the child. The case became a kind of shared grief, faceless yet intimate. Among detectives, theories began to circle. One suggestion was that the boy had belonged to a poor family, perhaps too overwhelmed to seek proper burial. Poverty had left scars across the city in those years, even as post-war prosperity lifted others. It was not unthinkable that a family might try to hide a tragedy out of shame, fear, or sheer lack of means. Another theory pointed toward orphanages or foster homes. The scars on the child's body suggested past medical treatment. Perhaps he had been institutionalized, moved from one home to another. If so, there should have been records, but no institution in the area admitted to losing track of a child fitting his description. It was possible, detectives thought, that someone in such a position might conceal the truth to protect themselves from blame. But without evidence, it remained speculation. Still others wondered if the boy might have come from farther away. Philadelphia was a city of crossroads, with highways and bus routes bringing in travelers every day. A family could have driven from hours away, chosen a quiet spot, and left the boy where no one would connect him to them. That theory was chilling, for it meant the search for his name might stretch far beyond the city. There were whispers, too, of darker possibilities: abuse, deliberate harm, even organized neglect. The bruises, the malnourishment, the rough haircut, these were not signs of an accident. They suggested a life of hardship, cut short not by mischance, but by cruelty. And yet, paradoxically, the washing of his body, the trimming of his nails, hinted at someone who cared about appearances, perhaps even about him, however twisted that care may have been. Detectives pursued every tip. One call came from a woman convinced the boy was her neighbor's child. Officers checked. The neighbor's child was alive and well. Another call claimed the boy matched a missing child from New Jersey, but the details did not align. Each false lead drained energy, yet each was necessary, for the chance of truth could never be ignored. As months passed, the boy's photograph was circulated across the country. Flyers were mailed to police departments in distant states. Articles ran in crime magazines. Truck drivers, salesmen, and tourists were urged to study the boy's face and think carefully about where they might have seen him. But no letter arrived with the missing piece. No phone call unlocked the silence. The burial, when it finally came, was simple: a small white coffin, a service attended by police, detectives, and a handful of clergy. The boy was laid to rest in a potter's field, marked not with a name, but with the memory of men who promised quietly to continue the search. Later, he would be moved to another resting place, his gravestone eventually carrying the inscription, "America's Unknown Child." But in 1957, he was simply lowered into the ground, the case still open, the questions still unresolved. And in the file room, theories multiplied. Some detectives held tightly to the idea of a foster home connection. Others favored the thought of a transient family, passing through. A few clung to the possibility of a local household hiding a shameful secret. Each theory had merit. Each clashed with the others. The truth, as always, remained silent. What haunted them most was the absence of the one thing every child should have: someone to claim him. In all of Philadelphia, in all of Pennsylvania, no mother, no father, no relative raised their hand to say, "That is our boy." The silence was almost louder than the discovery itself, and it deepened with every day that passed. The Philadelphia Police Department was no stranger to violent crime. Yet something about the case of the boy in the box unsettled even seasoned men. Perhaps it was his youth. Perhaps it was the sense of deliberate care with which he had been left behind. The washed body, the trimmed nails, the carefully folded blanket. This was not the casual cruelty of a street corner killing. It was something stranger, more intimate, and that strangeness made the silence around him almost unbearable. So the police turned outward, reaching to the public in a way that was unusual for its time. Handbills were printed in the thousands, showing the boy's face as rendered in a posed photograph after death. The image was unsettling, but the detectives insisted it might jog a memory, it might pull a name out of hiding. The flyers carried brief text, describing his approximate age, weight, and the few details they could confirm. Beneath it, the urgent plea. If you know this child, contact the Philadelphia Police Department. These flyers were not just handed out in the city. They were mailed to other precincts, to hospitals, to schools, to social service agencies. Postmen delivered them along their routes. Truck drivers carried them from one state to the next. The boy's face became a silent passenger on highways and back roads across the eastern seaboard. Newspapers carried the story as often as they could. One major paper in Philadelphia ran a nearly continuous campaign, publishing the boy's image and updating readers on each new development, or lack thereof. Letters poured into the newsroom from readers who thought they might know him, or who simply wanted to share their sorrow. Editors forwarded every promising tip to police, and though most evaporated under scrutiny, the effort itself kept the story alive in the public imagination. Detectives knew that sometimes cases turned not on evidence, but on memory. A neighbor remembering a child who disappeared, a nurse recognizing a surgical scar, a clerk recalling an odd purchase. So they allowed the story to breathe in the public square, even at the risk of ridicule. And ridicule did come. Sometimes, amateur sleuths sent elaborate letters filled with charts and arrows, convinced the boy was part of a secret conspiracy. Others pointed fingers at neighbors over petty grudges. The police, patient and methodical, sifted through it all. In one of the stranger turns, psychics became involved. It began with a few unsolicited letters from spiritualists claiming visions of where the boy had lived. Some described a house with wooden shutters, others a farm with a red barn, still others a family with many children. Police dismissed these at first, but public pressure mounted. Eventually, detectives agreed to at least follow one of the more detailed psychic directions. The psychic, a woman with a reputation for her work in missing person cases, described a house that seemed to match one on Susquehanna Road, not far from where the boy was found. Detectives visited the property. It belonged to a family with a foster care history, and the visit uncovered some unusual circumstances. But nothing definitive tied the family to the child in the box. Still, the very fact that a psychic's vision had led them there lingered in the case file. Not because it was evidence, but because it added another layer of unease. As though the case resisted ordinary logic and demanded attention from any quarter, rational or otherwise. Meanwhile, early suspects began to emerge. One line of inquiry focused on transient families, itinerant workers, carnival folk, or travelers who might have passed through Philadelphia. Detectives spent long hours interviewing workers in nearby fields, people living in temporary shelters, and those staying in cheap lodgings. They asked about missing children, about families who had come and gone quickly. Most shook their heads, bewildered at the questioning. Some mentioned rumors of children neglected in traveling groups, but no specific lead connected to the boy. Another line of suspicion fell on local orphanages and foster homes. The scars on the boy's body suggested medical treatment. Detectives combed through records, spoke with staff, and even interviewed children who might have remembered another boy among them. No institution admitted to losing track of a child, though whispers suggested that not all records were scrupulously kept. One orphanage in particular, sprawling, understaffed, overwhelmed with children, seemed a possible origin, but again, no documentation matched the boy's description. In the city morgue, meanwhile, detectives tried another tactic. They kept the boy's body preserved longer than usual, hoping a visitor, a missing persons officer, a nurse, perhaps even a worried parent, might recognize him. A few came to view him. None could provide a name, and so the case became a kind of riddle for the entire city. Newspapers called him America's unknown child. Ministers preached sermons about him, using his story as a warning against neglect. Teachers clipped the articles and discussed the mystery with their students. Some families even began to light a candle for him at night, as though by giving him a place in their homes they might compensate for the absence of his own. For detectives, the theories kept circling back. Someone had washed him. Someone had clipped his nails. Someone had cut his hair. And then, inexplicably, that same someone had left him in a cardboard box in the freezing woods. Why? Was it guilt? Panic? A cruel practicality? None of the explanations were sufficient. The case board grew crowded. photographs of the box, the blanket, the cap found nearby, maps with pins tracing possible routes a car could have taken, lists of orphanages, foster homes, and hospitals, a few highlighted names of potential suspects, each with a thick line eventually struck through when the lead went cold. Yet still, they pressed on. The boy was unknown, but he was not forgotten. And every unanswered question only deepened the city's commitment to finding the truth. Time has a way of pressing forward, even when mysteries remain unsolved. For the detectives, weeks of chasing leads had begun to blur together. Suspects came and went, files thickened, and still the boy remained unnamed. They faced a decision. The body could not remain at the morgue forever. He deserved rest, even if he did not yet have the dignity of a name. The funeral was simple, quiet, and solemn. A small white coffin had been arranged. Officers in their dark coats stood beside clergymen, their breath visible in the winter air as they gathered at the edge of the cemetery. Reporters came too, though they kept their voices hushed, as though speaking loudly would intrude on the fragile dignity of the moment. No mother wept openly over the coffin. No father leaned against the casket for support. Only detectives and strangers, bound not by kinship but by duty, bore witness. The boy was laid into the ground, his grave marked with the modest words of someone who had tried to offer at least a gesture of belonging. In time, that grave would carry a stone that read, "America's Unknown Child." But in 1957, it was simply a patch of earth, the boy beneath it, the mystery above it. For many detectives, the burial only sharpened their resolve. It was as if the boy's silence had been sealed in the ground, leaving them with only questions. In the weeks and months that followed, the case refused to fade. Rumors surfaced in barbershops, in church basements, in neighborhood taverns. Some whispered that the child had come from a prominent family, and that wealth and influence had allowed them to cover their tracks. Others speculated he was the unwanted child of a young mother, hidden away until tragedy struck. Still others suspected a foster arrangement gone horribly wrong. Each rumor carried a seed of possibility, but none bloomed into certainty. It was the foster home theory that seemed to take root most firmly among detectives. Not far from the place where the boy had been found stood a large property known for taking in children. This foster home had long been a fixture in the community, though its reputation was uneven. Some spoke of kindness there, of children sheltered and clothed. Others whispered of strict discipline, overcrowding, and poor oversight. In the climate of the late 1950s, such homes operated under looser regulations than they would decades later. Paperwork was spotty, inspections irregular. A child could slip between the cracks without the world taking much notice. Detectives visited the property multiple times. They interviewed the operators, the children, and even some of the neighbors. The foster home's proximity to the crime scene made it a natural focus. What if the boy had been living there? What if he had died under their care by accident or neglect and been quietly disposed of to avoid scandal? The theory seemed to explain several troubling details. The signs of medical treatment, the possibility of malnutrition, and the awkward haircut that looked like it had been done hurriedly by someone unskilled. Moreover, the decision to leave him in a cardboard box, so close to home, suggested both recklessness and desperation. A child buried properly might prompt too many questions. A child left miles away might require too much effort. But a child placed in a nearby patch of woods, under cover of darkness, that seemed feasible for someone trying to conceal a secret in haste. Still, the evidence was thin. The foster home kept no record of a missing child that matched his description. None of the other children identified him as someone they had known. Staff members denied any knowledge of him. The case file thickened with notes, suspicions, and possibilities, but lacked the one thing detectives needed: proof. Even so, the foster home theory never left the case entirely. It lingered in conversations, resurfaced in later years, and was revisited whenever new investigators took a fresh look at the file. To many, it was the explanation that seemed closest to plausible. Though without a name, without documentation, it could not stand on its own. The community, too, found itself haunted by the possibility. Families in the area drove past the foster home with uneasy glances. Some wondered if the children inside were safe. Others defended the home, insisting it provided shelter where otherwise there would have been none. The truth, as with so many parts of the case, remained hidden. Meanwhile, the boy's story continued to echo outward. The newspapers did not let it go. Occasionally, fresh articles appeared, updating the public on new theories, new searches, new pleas for information. The phrase "boy in the box" had by then entered the local vocabulary. For many, it was not just a headline. It was a ghostly presence in their own city, a reminder that even in familiar neighborhoods, there were secrets too dark to ignore. Detectives pressed on. They knew cases like this did not fade simply because they grew cold. Someone, somewhere held the truth. And even if the foster home theory did not provide the final answer, it marked one of the earliest serious attempts to draw the shadow closer to the light. By the 1960s, the boy's grave had already been visited countless times. Detectives, reporters, and ordinary citizens stood at the small patch of earth, sometimes leaving flowers, sometimes standing in silence. Though the years passed, the case never truly left the public's mind. It lived in headlines that resurfaced each anniversary, in whispers shared at family tables, and in the files that sat heavy in the police department's cold case cabinet. Detectives had rotated in and out of the case. Some retired, some transferred. New faces took up the task, reviewing the same photographs, the same fibers, the same heartbreaking questions. Each time, there was hope that fresh eyes might spot what had been overlooked. The 1960s brought new attempts at exposure. National crime magazines featured the case, printing the boy's picture alongside bold captions. "Who is he? Why does no one claim him?" These spreads reached thousands of readers across the country, and for a brief moment, letters poured in again. A woman in Ohio was certain she had seen him at a bus station. A man in Florida claimed the boy matched a child once adopted by neighbors. A nurse in Michigan recalled treating a boy with a similar scar. Police dutifully chased each lead, sending telegrams, making long-distance calls, traveling when necessary. Each time, the trail went cold. The psychics, too, had not given up. One in particular, the same woman whose vision had once directed police to the foster home, renewed her claim. She insisted again that the boy had lived in a household not far from the crime scene, with a stepmother who had treated him cruelly. She described wooden paneling, a farmhouse, a set of steps that creaked underfoot. Detectives once more visited similar homes in the area, walking through dim hallways, looking for anything that matched her description. Again, nothing was proven, and yet the uncanny overlap between her visions and the foster home's location kept her testimony alive in the public imagination. By the early 1970s, the case had cooled to a chilling degree. Files were reviewed less frequently. New murders, new crimes demanded attention. Yet, even in its dormancy, the boy in the box haunted the department. Detectives carried the image in their minds, some keeping clippings in their desk drawers as reminders. And then came the most infamous twist: the confession of a woman known as Martha. Martha had lived a turbulent life, marked by trauma, instability, and long periods of estrangement from her family. In the early 1970s, she came forward with a story that stunned investigators. She claimed that, as a child, she had lived in a home not far from where the boy was found. Her mother, she alleged, had taken in the boy, not formally, not legally, but in a way that blurred the lines between fostering and captivity. According to Martha, the boy had been subjected to cruelty and neglect within that home. She recounted moments of abuse, of punishments doled out in harsh and unusual ways. And then, she said, one day it had gone too far. The boy had been killed, not with malice, she suggested, but as the result of relentless mistreatment. The detail that shook detectives most was what followed. Martha claimed her mother, in a panic, had washed the boy, trimmed his nails, cut his hair, and then placed him in the box. She described a late-night drive, the cardboard container in the car, her mother lifting it into the woods while Martha watched from the vehicle. The parallels to the crime scene were undeniable. The washing, the haircut, the placement in a box. Martha's story seemed to align with what the detectives already knew. For the first time in years, the investigation felt alive again. But as always, complications arose. Martha's background was troubled. She had a history of mental health struggles. Her accounts of other events in her life often wavered or conflicted. Detectives interviewed her extensively, visited the property she described, even dug into her mother's past. They hoped desperately for a piece of physical evidence, something to tie the foster home, the box, the boy, and Martha's story together. Yet proof never came. The house Martha pointed to had long since changed hands. The alleged perpetrators were gone, dead, or unreachable. No records surfaced that confirmed a boy of his description had lived there. Without corroboration, her testimony could not stand alone. And so, what might have been the solution dissolved into another shadow. For some detectives, Martha's story remained the most convincing explanation they had ever heard. For others, it was simply another mirage, a tale woven from knowledge already public, perhaps reshaped by memory, trauma, or imagination. Still, the confession marked a turning point. It revived the case in the media, spurred new headlines, and rekindled public sorrow. Once again, the boy's photograph appeared in newspapers. Once again, the question echoed, who was he? For the investigators, Martha's words became another thread in the endless tapestry of the case. They could not prove her story true. They could not prove it false. It hovered in the space between haunting, unsettling, and forever incomplete. The woman who called herself Martha did not rush her way into the case. She arrived by degrees, through letters, through hesitant interviews, through the kind of halting narrative that belongs to someone sorting memory from fear. From the moment her claims reached detectives' desks, they stirred a very particular kind of attention. The details she offered aligned with what investigators already knew in troubling ways. A washed body, trimmed nails, a hurried haircut, a nighttime drive, a cardboard box. The echoes were too strong to ignore. Detectives met with her more than once. They asked the same questions several different ways, a common technique not for trapping but for clarifying. When had she first seen the boy? How long had he lived in the home she described? What rooms had he stayed in? Who else had been present? Where did the box come from? She answered, sometimes with confidence, sometimes with hesitations that seemed to surprise even her. Trauma can do that. It can leave a person with islands of certainty in a sea of fog. They traveled to the addresses she named. Some houses were still standing, though altered by time. Others had long since been remodeled, sold, or torn down. They stood in driveways and on cracked sidewalks, trying to reconcile the present with the scenes she described from decades earlier. They spoke to neighbors who had lived in the area in those years, older men and women who carried their own stores of neighborhood lore. A few remembered a strict household. One recalled children who seemed to come and go. Another thought there had been yelling on certain nights. None could confirm the presence of a specific little boy whose fate matched the one in the case file. Investigators pulled what records they could. Old city listings, property rolls, fragments of school documents, anything that might place a child in the orbit of the home Martha described. The paper trail, though, was thin. Mid-century records for informal placements were often incomplete to begin with. Decades later, even the incomplete ones were sometimes missing altogether. What remained were hints, not anchors, a name half-remembered, a notation without context, a file that mentioned a foster arrangement without identifying the child. They brought in clinicians to evaluate her. A forensic specialist spoke with Martha at length. The goal wasn't to declare her right or wrong, but to understand whether her account carried the hallmarks of experience or invention. The resulting view was cautious. Parts of her story felt lived in. Tactile details, emotional notes, the kind of small, unglamorous specifics that people rarely fabricate with consistency. Other parts strained under the weight of time. Memories blurred. Dates shifted. A scene repeated with slightly altered framing. None of this was unusual for someone speaking about childhood events. none of it was the same as corroboration. Within the department, opinions divided. Some detectives, especially those who had carried the case in their minds for years, admitted privately that Martha's narrative was the most plausible explanation they had encountered. It tied the inexplicable together: the washing, the nails, the haircut, the proximity to the dump site, the desperate choice of a discarded carton. It fit the emotional logic of a household trying to hide a tragedy. Haste, proximity, secrecy. Others remained unconvinced. They pointed out that the broad contours of the case had been public knowledge for years, printed in newspapers, discussed on radio, revisited in anniversary articles. A motivated person could fold those elements into a first-person story. They noted, too, that certain specifics Martha offered didn't align neatly with autopsy findings or documented timelines. She described scenes the evidence couldn't quite hold, and placed people where later checks suggested they might not have been. The foster home orbit around the case made the debate even harder to resolve. Long before Martha, a civil investigator attached to the medical examiner's office had spent years pursuing a foster home angle, walking the grounds, measuring distances, and even, at one point, letting a psychic's description nudge him toward a particular property. For him, the geography meant something: the woods, the road, the box, the idea of someone choosing a location they knew too well to fear. After his death, the maps and notes he left behind still spoke that same argument. The solution, if it existed, was nearby. Martha's account seemed to sit inside that argument like a puzzle piece that both fit and didn't, depending on how you turned it. The case file swelled with addenda, typed summaries of interviews with Martha, handwritten notations in margins, check timeline, verify property owner, re-interview neighbor on corner house. A list of tasks that had no natural endpoint because the trail they followed was made of memory rather than paper. Detectives who believed her pushed for deeper dives, cross-state inquiries, renewed checks on old foster records, attempt to identify any child quietly placed and quietly lost. Detectives who doubted her pushed just as hard in the other direction. Test each claim, require a document, find a witness. In an odd way, the tension made the work more disciplined. Years slid by. The woman behind the pseudonym moved in and out of contact. Sometimes she responded quickly. Sometimes letters went unanswered. Investigators updated their internal memos whenever she resurfaced, and each time they tried again for that one piece of independent proof that would push the story over the threshold from plausible to provable. It never came. What kept the Martha thread alive was less a single revelatory detail than the way it solved the case's most human contradictions. Why was the child malnourished, yet freshly washed? Why the rough haircut, so close to death? Why a box meant for a nursery, a bassinet carton, rather than a bag or a blanket alone? Why choose a site so near to homes rather than a remote field many miles away? In Martha's telling, these weren't random oddities. They were the fingerprints of panic in a household already bent by secrecy. And yet, that was also the problem. A theory that explains everything without leaving behind something you can hold. A receipt, a registry, a photograph, a single unambiguous witness remains a theory. Detectives knew it. Prosecutors knew it. Even Martha, at times, seemed to know it, her voice softening in interviews when she reached the parts of her story that had to stand alone. The boy in the box case endured precisely because it lived at this intersection, where forensic fact meets the shape of a human story, where what is recorded runs out and what is remembered begins. For some who worked it, Martha was the best map they had ever been offered. For others, she was a map sketched over a landscape the department had already walked, with landmarks that matched because they were always there. Through it all, the photograph remained on desks and bulletin boards. The child's face, the careful, softened image used for public appeals, looked out from under thumbtacks and paper clips. Detectives came and went. Retirements gathered. Promotions were celebrated. The city changed around the file cabinets. But the picture stayed, carrying forward the silent question that had always framed the case. If this story is true, where is the proof? And if it is not, then who was he, and where does his real story live? The department did what diligent departments do. They kept both doors open. They left the Martha file in place, not as a solved chapter, but as a sustained possibility. They also continued to treat the case as wider than any single account. New detectives re-canvassed neighborhoods, rechecked orphan records that had been newly digitized, revisited medical notes with more modern eyes. The evidence collected in 1957, hair, fibers, the blanket, the box history, remained sealed and cataloged for the day when science might ask and answer a different set of questions. In that way, Martha became part of the case's architecture rather than its finish. Her story was a room you had to walk through to understand the house, even if you never chose to live there. It shaped the way future investigators thought about proximity, family secrecy, and the quiet logistical choices that desperate people make. It warned against discarding accounts that sounded too neat, and it warned just as loudly against embracing them without proof. The boy's grave, meanwhile, continued to draw visitors. Some came because of Martha, believing they finally understood the human equation behind the evidence. Others came despite her, preferring to stand with the parts of the case that could be touched. A stone, a date, the phrase that gave the child a place in the national conscience. America's unknown child. Flowers went down. Hands rested on cool granite. Promises were made in whispers that carried on the wind across the cemetery lawn. All of it, the interviews, the evaluations, the skeptical memos, the hopeful ones, would matter when a new century arrived with tools the original detectives couldn't have imagined. The careful preservation of evidence. The institutional memory that refused to throw any thread away. The willingness to keep an unproved story on the table without letting it claim the entire meal. Those decisions kept the case alive long enough for another kind of answer to walk in through the lab door. If you're ready, we can move into Chunk 8, Exhumations, DNA, and the Long Road to a Name. A slow, detailed account of how the case crossed from fingerprint cards and neighborhood canvases into the era of genetic genealogy, culminating in the identification that finally gave the boy back his name. The passing of years did not erase the boy's memory. Instead, it deepened the sense of obligation among those who worked the case. Detectives came and went, police commissioners changed, entire divisions reorganized, but the file marked unknown child never left the shelves. By the late 20th century, the boy in the box had become both a tragedy and a symbol, a reminder of innocence lost and of justice delayed. The grave itself bore witness to this. Buried first in a potter's field, the boy had a simple resting place, marked by a headstone that bore no name. It read only, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy, February 25th, 1957. Over time, as interest in the case persisted, donations flowed in. In 1998, his body was moved to Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, a more permanent site where a polished stone was erected. The new marker read, "America's Unknown Child." Visitors left flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. Some pressed coins into the earth as small tokens of remembrance. By then, forensic science had already transformed how investigations were conducted. DNA analysis, once the stuff of cutting-edge research, was becoming a standard tool in criminal cases. Detectives, still haunted by the boy's silence, began to wonder, could these new techniques finally speak for him? In 1998, his body was exhumed for the first time. The process was solemn, respectful, watched by investigators who had carried the case for decades. Samples were taken, hair, teeth, bits of bone, all carefully preserved and sent to labs for analysis. At the time, the hope was modest. DNA could now be extracted and typed, creating a genetic profile. That profile, it was thought, could be compared against missing persons databases or held in waiting for some future match. The boy's remains were then reburied at Ivy Hill Cemetery. This time, mourners gathered as if for a family funeral, though no family had ever been identified. Detectives and citizens stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wept, others prayed. A few simply stood in silence, heads bowed, their presence a vow that he would not be forgotten. The DNA work yielded a profile, but it was not enough to give him back his name. In the late 1990s, databases were smaller, technology more limited. Matches required relatives to already be in the system, and there was no guarantee anyone would be. The case remained unsolved, but now it carried a new form of hope, the knowledge that science could continue to evolve. Through the 2000s, detectives revisited the file again and again. Cold case squads were formed, staffed by investigators who believed in using every available resource. They pored over evidence: the blanket, the box, the boy's hair. They consulted forensic anthropologists who reconstructed his face, producing new composite sketches that imagined how he might have looked in life. These images were distributed nationally, appearing on websites, in newspapers, and on television. Each time, the question repeated: does anyone recognize him? In 2019, the case saw another turning point. Advances in genetic genealogy, the same technology that had identified the Golden State Killer, offered a new possibility. With this technique, investigators didn't need a direct match in a criminal database. Instead, they could use the boy's DNA to build a family tree, tracing distant relatives and working backward until a likely identity emerged. But to do this, they needed stronger DNA samples than the 1990s had provided. And so, in 2019, the boy's body was exhumed once again. The cemetery was quiet that day, as officials gathered to oversee the process. Samples were carefully collected, handled with the most modern protocols available. The boy was returned to his grave, his headstone once more surrounded by flowers and tributes from strangers who had come to see him as their own. The samples were sent to specialized labs. Scientists worked delicately, coaxing usable sequences from decades-old remains. The process took time, years, in fact, as profiles were built, checked, and fed into genealogical databases. Slowly, branches of a family tree began to emerge. Distant relatives appeared, names unfamiliar to investigators but connected by strands of shared DNA. With each relative identified, genealogists moved closer, trimming away dead ends, following lines of descent, piecing together a family history one name at a time. Detectives watched the process with both caution and hope. They had been here before, on the edge of resolution, only to have the trail dissolve. But this time, the science was different. This time, the boy was not just an image in a file or a memory in an aging detective's mind. He was a set of identifiable markers in the fabric of heredity, tugging at strands that led back to real people. By late 2022, after nearly 2 years of genealogical research, the answer finally arrived. The boy in the box had a name: Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was 4 years old. Born in 1953, he had lived in West Philadelphia. He had parents. He had siblings. He had a family tree, long and complicated, but undeniably his. For the detectives, the moment was profound. After 65 years of anonymity, the child who had once been simply America's unknown boy was no longer unknown. His name was spoken aloud in press conferences. His photograph was shown not as a riddle, but as a child who had been someone's son, someone's brother. The city, which had carried him nameless for so long, finally addressed him as Joseph. Yet even this triumph carried sorrow. Identifying Joseph did not immediately solve the questions of how and why he died. His parents were both deceased by the time the identification was made. Extended relatives offered fragments of family history, but no clear explanation for the boy's fate. Detectives emphasized that the investigation remained open. A name was a beginning, not an ending. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, his headstone was updated. Flowers appeared in greater numbers than ever before. Some left toys, small cars, and stuffed animals, tokens meant for the little boy he had once been. Others left candles, prayers for peace, promises of remembrance. Visitors now whispered, not only America's unknown child, but Joseph. The name carried across the grass like a benediction, soft and overdue. When the news broke in December 2022, the city of Philadelphia seemed to pause for a moment. Journalists crowded into a police press conference, their cameras pointed toward a podium flanked by detectives, city officials, and members of the forensic team who had carried the case across the finish line. On the table before them lay the photograph that had haunted the city for 65 years. The boy in the box, the carefully retouched image that softened the bruises and showed a child who might have been anyone's son. For the first time since that February morning in 1957, the photograph was paired with a name. The police commissioner stepped to the microphone, his voice low, deliberate, careful not to stumble on the syllables. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The room was quiet at first. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Others sat in silence, registering the weight of what they had just heard. A name, a birthday, a life that had been unknown for so long was suddenly specific, real, anchored in history. It was as if the city itself had been holding its breath for decades, and only now was allowed to exhale. Detectives spoke of the case as if it were a living presence that had walked alongside them for years. Some of them had inherited it from predecessors long since retired. They described it as a shadow in their offices, a question mark that followed them home at night. To them, identifying Joseph was not just a procedural victory. It was a fulfillment of a promise they had made silently every time they touched the file, that this boy would not remain nameless forever. Family members of Joseph, distant but still linked by blood, had been notified before the public announcement. Not all were willing to speak publicly. Some expressed shock, others grief, and still others confusion about what exactly had happened all those years ago. What was clear, however, was that the boy once thought to be without a family at all had deep and complicated roots in the city. He had parents, he had siblings, he had cousins and aunts and uncles. He had, in fact, never been as alone as he seemed inside that cardboard box. The commissioner emphasized that the identification was not the end of the story. It was, in fact, a beginning. The cause of death had been determined decades earlier: blunt force trauma and malnutrition, but the identity of the person responsible remained unresolved. Detectives confirmed that Joseph's death was still officially classified as a homicide, and that the investigation into who had harmed him and why was very much ongoing. For many Philadelphians, the revelation was emotional in a different way. Over 6 decades, the boy had become ours. America's unknown child was not just a case file. He was a presence in the city's cultural memory, a child mourned by strangers who had claimed him as their own. For the volunteers who had paid for his headstone, for the cemetery caretakers who had trimmed the grass around his grave, for the citizens who had left flowers every year on the anniversary of his discovery, the name was both a gift and a reminder. He was Joseph now, no longer anonymous, but that very specificity sharpened the ache. Newspaper headlines captured the weight of the announcement. Unknown no longer. Philadelphia's lost boy identified. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The boy in the box has a name. The stories were reprinted nationally and internationally, as the case that had once been the subject of whispered theories and late-night radio shows found itself back in the center of attention. Television crews shot footage at Ivy Hill Cemetery, where Joseph's grave was suddenly surrounded by new flowers, new stuffed animals, and candles that flickered against the stone marker. For the detectives, the press conference was not closure. It was rather a transition. They had given the boy back his name, but now came the harder task: to understand the forces in his short life that had led him to that box in the woods. They faced the cruel arithmetic of time. Witnesses aging, records lost, memories dimmed, but they also carried tools their predecessors had never had. DNA had identified him. Perhaps DNA, combined with new databases and new technology, could one day lead to the person or persons who had ended his life. For the public, the revelation stirred reflection. People who had grown up in Philadelphia in the 1950s and 60s remembered the case vividly. They recalled the handbills that had been distributed to homes and businesses, the radio announcements pleading for information, the way parents would remind their children never to stray too far from home. Now, they found themselves face to face with the child they had once feared for. Joseph was no longer a faceless emblem of danger, but a boy whose parents had lived in their city, whose siblings had walked its streets. The crime was not a mystery in the abstract anymore. It was a wound in the community's own family tree. At Ivy Hill, detectives gathered once more, as they had in 1998 and again in 2019, when Joseph was exhumed. They laid flowers at his grave, standing in silence, hats removed, some whispering prayers. One officer, gray-haired and near retirement, later said quietly to a reporter, "He has his name now. That's all we could promise him, and we kept it." The aftermath of the identification was thus a strange combination of triumph and sorrow. The case had crossed into history long ago, but now it lived again in the present tense. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was no longer the unknown child, but he was still a child whose story was incomplete, whose final chapter had yet to be written. When the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli was first spoken aloud, it came with both relief and an avalanche of new questions. For 6.5 decades, the mystery had been, who was he? Now the city had an answer, but that answer pointed to an even deeper unknown. How had Joseph's young life led to the woods of Fox Chase, to a cardboard box, and to the silence that cloaked him for so many years? What investigators confirmed quickly was that Joseph had been born in January of 1953. His family was not distant strangers, not migrants who had passed briefly through Philadelphia and vanished. They were Philadelphians themselves, rooted in the very city where his body was later found. He had a mother. He had a father. He had siblings. He was, in the starkest and saddest sense, never as alone as he seemed when his body was lifted from the earth. But from the very beginning, it was clear the family story was complicated. Detectives acknowledged that Joseph's parents were both long deceased by the time of his identification. They did not reveal their names publicly at first, citing the need to balance transparency with sensitivity. What they did reveal was that Joseph had been born into a family struggling under difficult circumstances. Accounts that trickled into the public domain hinted at turmoil, strained relationships, instability, and perhaps neglect. Genealogists who built Joseph's family tree traced lines of descent stretching across multiple generations in Philadelphia. Relatives still living were contacted quietly, informed of the results, and in some cases asked for cooperation. Not all responded. For some, the news was overwhelming. Imagine discovering that the child who had been America's unknown boy for more than 60 years was, in fact, your uncle or your cousin or your half-brother. The weight of that revelation was not something every family member was willing to bear in public. Investigators, cautious not to jeopardize any chance of criminal accountability, revealed only what they could. Joseph's parents, they explained, had been identified. His extended family had been mapped. He had half-siblings. He had descendants of cousins still living in the area. But beyond those bare facts, much was held back. The secrecy frustrated some in the public, who longed for the final puzzle piece. But detectives knew better. To them, names and addresses were not just lines on a family chart. They were leads, potential witnesses, potential suspects. They could not afford to let curiosity outweigh the chance, however slim, of accountability. Still, pieces emerged. Local reporters, digging through public records and death certificates, began to assemble the outlines of Joseph's lineage. His father, Augustus, had lived in Philadelphia. His mother, Mary, had also resided in the city. Together, they had more children after Joseph. Those children grew up, lived their lives, some remaining in the city, others dispersing. None, however, had ever spoken publicly of a missing brother. And so a new question took root. How does a family lose a 4-year-old boy, never report him missing, and allow his body to lie in anonymity for decades? Was it shame? Was it fear? Or was it something more sinister, an awareness, however unspoken, of how he had come to his end? Detectives avoided speculation, but they acknowledged the strangeness. Joseph had not been a child without ties. He had not been abandoned in infancy. He had a household, a neighborhood, a family tree stretching across the city. Yet somehow, when he disappeared, no one came forward. The answer, some suggested, might lie in the family's dysfunction. Accounts gathered through distant relatives painted a picture of hardship and secrecy. There were rumors of abuse, whispers of neglect, fragments of memory that suggested Joseph's life had not been easy even before his final days. Martha's testimony from the 1970s, though never confirmed, suddenly seemed less like an aberration and more like a dark echo of possibility. And yet, without cooperation from those who had lived through it, much of Joseph's family history remained a maze. Detectives pressed gently where they could, reviewing property records, old photographs, birth certificates. They traced who lived where, who might have cared for Joseph in his short life, who might have seen him in his last weeks. Some relatives were helpful. Others declined comment. A few denied knowledge altogether. The complexity of Joseph's family background underscored the tragedy of his case. He had not been a nameless wanderer, not a child cast off in a faraway place. He had been part of Philadelphia's fabric, with kin scattered across its neighborhoods. And yet, somehow, every thread had frayed, leaving him alone in the woods until strangers found him. What investigators concluded publicly was simple but haunting. Joseph had a family, but his family had failed him. How deeply, how deliberately, and with what consequences? Those were the questions that still lingered, waiting to be answered. In the meantime, the revelation of his family background reshaped the way Philadelphians thought of the case. For decades, the boy in the box had seemed like a stranger among them, a mystery unmoored from context. Now, he was theirs not just in sorrow, but in truth. He had been born in their city, lived in their city, and died in their city. His story was Philadelphia's story, as intimate and as heartbreaking as any could be. When detectives stood before the microphones in December 2022, they were careful to make one point absolutely clear. Identifying Joseph Augustus Zarelli did not close the case. It was not an ending. It was the start of a new chapter. After 65 years, the case was, and remains, classified as an open homicide investigation. The identification gave investigators two essential tools they had never had before: a name and a family network. For the first time, detectives could anchor their work not in abstractions, but in specifics. They could ask, who was in Joseph's life in January and February of 1957? Who saw him last? Who had the means, the opportunity, and perhaps the motive to harm him? These are questions that could now be mapped onto real people with real addresses, real histories. But even with this breakthrough, the obstacles were daunting. Time had eroded much of what might once have been evidence. Witnesses who could have spoken in 1957 were now elderly, if they were alive at all. Records from the era were spotty. Many were incomplete, some lost altogether in the bureaucratic churn of decades. Memories, even for those still living, had blurred into the haze of age. Detectives acknowledged this with a mixture of realism and determination. They could not expect a tidy resolution, but they could work the case as best they could, applying every modern resource to the fragments that remained. They began with the family tree, developed through genetic genealogy. Each name was checked against records, each address cross-referenced with city directories, each life traced as far back as possible. They consulted medical records where available. They reviewed census data, baptismal certificates, school enrollment lists. They reconstructed, as best they could, the geography of Joseph's early childhood. Which homes did he live in? Which doctors might have seen him? Which neighbors might have noticed him? They also returned to the crime scene itself, even though 6 decades had passed. Fox Chase, the wooded area where the box had been left, had changed, but certain landmarks remained. Detectives walked the ground, considering again the logistics. How had the box been carried there? By car? On foot? Had the perpetrator known the area well, or chosen it by chance? These questions mattered as much in 2022 as they had in 1957. The box itself had long since been cataloged, photographed, and preserved. Investigators studied it again with modern tools, considering not just its make and model, but microscopic traces of fiber or soil that might have been overlooked. The blanket was revisited too, its faded patterns scanned with high-resolution imaging to search for clues invisible in the 1950s. But perhaps the most promising avenue was the human one. Detectives reached out quietly to surviving relatives. Some were cooperative, some were not. Some professed ignorance. Others expressed shock. A few were wary of the attention. Yet every conversation, every fragment of memory, added threads to the tapestry. Detectives asked, did anyone recall Joseph as a child? Did anyone remember a sibling who had disappeared? Did anyone hear whispers within the family long ago about something gone wrong? In parallel, investigators kept the public involved. The Philadelphia Police Department issued statements reminding citizens that Joseph's case was still active. They encouraged tips, no matter how small. They set up dedicated phone lines, assuring callers that even the faintest recollection could matter. They reminded the city that while Joseph had been identified, justice for him remained unfinished. Forensic experts continued their work too. DNA could now be tested in ways that far surpassed the 1990s and even the early 2010s. Analysts explored not only direct comparisons, but also mitochondrial DNA, Y-DNA, and other markers that might point toward paternal or maternal lineages. Genealogical databases, updated constantly, were monitored for new entries that might tighten the family tree and point toward more immediate relatives. Still, detectives knew the cruel truth. The person or persons responsible for Joseph's death might no longer be alive. His parents had both died before his identification. If either had been directly involved, accountability might never be possible in a courtroom. But detectives also considered the possibility that others had known, that others had seen, that others had kept silent. Silence itself could become a lead if it was widespread enough, if enough relatives turned away from the same memory. The city, for its part, rallied once more. Community groups renewed their commitment to Joseph's grave, tending it, decorating it with flowers and teddy bears. Crime forums online lit up with renewed discussion, theories debated, timelines reconstructed. Ordinary citizens, some old enough to remember the original headlines, others born decades later, all felt the same pull, to know what had happened, to understand why, to see justice even after so much time. The homicide unit of the Philadelphia Police Department made it clear that the case would never be closed until an official resolution was reached. Joseph's identification had breathed new life into the investigation. Detectives, even those nearing retirement, promised to carry the file forward. Younger investigators, inheriting the case, spoke of it with reverence, as if receiving not just a file, but a charge. And so, more than 60 years after the boy in the box was found, the case remained open. The pursuit was no longer about an unknown child. It was about a boy named Joseph, who had lived, who had been part of a family, who had deserved better than he received. Detectives carried his photograph not as a mystery to be solved, but as a child to be honored, a child whose story demanded its final chapter. To understand why the boy in the box mystery endured for more than 65 years, one must first step back into the investigative world of 1957. The Philadelphia Police Department, like most in America at the time, worked with a toolkit that now feels almost rudimentary. Fingerprinting existed, yes, but it was limited. Blood typing could offer only the broadest categories. Forensic science was still decades away from DNA analysis, from computer-assisted genealogy, from the microscopic comparisons that modern laboratories perform as routine. When Joseph's body was first found, detectives did what was considered thorough work for the time. They dusted the box and the blanket for prints. They compared the boy's dental records, or rather, the absence of dental records, to listings in missing children registries. They canvassed hospitals, orphanages, and schools. They even published post-mortem photographs in newspapers, hoping that public recognition might succeed where formal methods had failed. But no name came. Part of the reason the case stretched so long was the silence of Joseph's family. Had anyone come forward in 1957 to say, "A child is missing from our household," the investigation might have taken a very different turn. Instead, no missing persons report was filed. No parent, no relative, no neighbor stepped forward to claim him. To detectives, that absence of reporting was almost as baffling as the crime itself. How could a child simply vanish from his own family without triggering alarm? The broader culture of the 1950s also played its role. Abuse within families was less likely to be spoken of openly. Institutions were less prepared to intervene in what was often considered the private sphere of domestic life. Even if neighbors suspected neglect or mistreatment, they may have hesitated to act or convinced themselves it was not their place. In that silence, Joseph's suffering could unfold unseen, and his death could be hidden. Technological limitations compounded the problem. The box in which Joseph was found was traced to a local appliance store, but records of who purchased it were incomplete. The blanket was of a common design, sold in large quantities, and impossible to narrow down. Leads fizzled. Witnesses contradicted one another, and as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the trail grew colder. Through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the case lingered like a ghost. Detectives who had once pounded the streets in search of Joseph's name retired, passing the file to younger colleagues. Each new detective began where the last had left off, combing through the same notes, revisiting the same photographs. Some made incremental progress, others reached dead ends. By the 1990s, advances in DNA technology offered new hope. Joseph's remains were exhumed, samples collected, profiles built. But the databases were still too small, the science not yet advanced enough to generate answers. The file returned once more to the shelves. What changed everything was the rise of forensic genealogy in the 2010s. When detectives authorized Joseph's DNA to be uploaded into genealogical databases, they suddenly had a new tool. Not just a genetic profile, but a family tree. Matches to distant cousins could be plotted, branches of lineage explored, identities triangulated. Forensic genealogists, part detective and part historian, worked tirelessly to reconstruct Joseph's ancestry. It was this slow, meticulous labor, the cross-referencing of birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, that ultimately gave him back his name. The length of the case also reshaped investigative culture. In Philadelphia, detectives pointed to Joseph's story as a symbol of persistence. It taught them never to abandon a file, never to assume a case was beyond solving. It also highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary work, detectives collaborating with genealogists, forensic scientists, even volunteers from the public who pored over archives in their spare time. Nationally, the Boy in the Box case became one of the touchstones that illustrated both the limitations of mid-century policing and the promise of modern forensic science. When Joseph was finally named, law enforcement agencies across the country took note. Cold cases long thought unsolvable were re-examined with fresh eyes. Families who had waited decades for answers began to believe that closure might still be possible, even after generations. But the length of Joseph's case also underscored something more somber, that justice delayed can sometimes become justice denied. Even with his name restored, even with his story known, the possibility that his killer or killers might already be dead loomed large. Detectives knew that solving the case in a legal sense might never happen. What they could do, however, was ensure that Joseph himself was not forgotten. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli thus became more than a crime scene. It became a mirror held up to the city and to the nation, showing how far forensic science had come, how much persistence mattered, and how silence within families and communities could allow tragedy to go unspoken for too long. And in the end, it became a testament to human endurance. For 6 decades, strangers cared for Joseph's memory when those closest to him did not. For 6 decades, detectives refused to let the case disappear into history. For 6 decades, citizens left flowers at his grave, whispering his name even when it was unknown. When the breakthrough finally came, it was not just a technological victory, but a moral one. The persistence had been worth it. The lesson was clear. No case, no matter how cold, should ever be truly closed. When a mystery lingers unsolved for as long as the Boy in the Box did, it inevitably transforms into something larger than a police case. It becomes part of the cultural landscape, a story retold in whispers, in newspaper columns, in books and documentaries, even in folklore. Joseph Augustus Zarelli's story became exactly that, a thread woven not only through the fabric of Philadelphia, but through the imagination of countless people who never knew him personally, yet felt bound to him by curiosity, sorrow, or a longing for justice. From the very beginning, newspapers ensured that Joseph's story would not vanish. In 1957, coverage was relentless. Headlines screamed, "The Boy in the Box," each edition bringing new speculation, new theories, new leads. Journalists described the discovery in chilling detail, printing photographs of Joseph, both in lifelike sketches and, controversially, post-mortem, in hopes that someone might recognize him. For better or worse, these images cemented him in the public consciousness. Citizens clipped the articles, saved them, shared them. For many Philadelphians, Joseph was not just an anonymous child. He was a haunting presence in their city's story. As the years passed, the case's unresolved nature drew writers and filmmakers. True crime anthologies devoted chapters to him. Documentaries featured the case alongside other mysteries, positioning him as one of America's most famous John Does. In some programs, Joseph's story was framed as emblematic of cold cases everywhere, a reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, darkness could unfold without warning. Books on unsolved crimes frequently gave him prominent placement. Authors explored every theory: the foster home, Martha's testimony, the possibility of a family cover-up. Some books leaned towards sensationalism, weaving narratives more dramatic than factual. Others, more restrained, emphasized the enduring grief of an unidentified child, treated as evidence rather than as a person. Either way, Joseph's story reached readers far beyond Philadelphia, spreading across the United States and even internationally. Television brought the case to new audiences. Programs such as America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries introduced the Boy in the Box to viewers who had never heard of him before. These episodes often generated flurries of tips, some credible, many not. Each airing reignited public attention, each reminder keeping Joseph from fading into obscurity. Beyond formal media, Joseph's story also entered the realm of folklore. In Philadelphia, the Fox Chase Woods gained an eerie reputation. Teenagers dared one another to walk through the area at night, whispering that the boy's spirit lingered there. Stories circulated in hushed tones, stories of strange sounds, of shadows flitting through trees, of a child's cry carried on the wind. Though grounded in tragedy, these tales became part of the city's folklore, reminders that the past had not been laid to rest. In community memory, Joseph also became a symbol. His grave, first marked simply as America's unknown child, drew visitors from across the country. Strangers left flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes. Some prayed for him. Others asked for his intercession in their own troubles, as if a child so wronged in life might carry special compassion in the afterlife. The grave became not only a memorial, but a place of pilgrimage, where grief for one boy mingled with grief for countless others lost too soon. Joseph's anonymity gave his story a universal resonance. For decades, anyone could look at his sketch and imagine he was their missing relative, their neighbor's child, a boy who could have lived on their own block. He became, in a sense, everyone's child, a stand-in for all children who suffered abuse in silence, whose voices were never heard. Advocacy groups against child abuse cited his case as a symbol of the need for vigilance, compassion, and reform. The identification of Joseph in 2022 did not diminish this cultural role. If anything, it deepened it. For many, learning his name brought a new sense of connection. He was no longer merely the boy in the box. He was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a boy with parents, siblings, a birthday. The transformation from anonymous symbol to identified child shifted the tone of remembrance. It was no longer only about mystery. It was about mourning a real person whose story had at last been restored. His influence even reached into art. Local painters created works inspired by his story, often depicting an empty box, a child's silhouette, or a lone figure walking into the woods. Poets wrote verses about lost innocence, about a city carrying the weight of an unanswered question. Musicians composed ballads that evoked sorrow, haunting melodies that seemed to linger like his memory itself. On the internet, Joseph's case flourished as well. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured thread after thread, dissecting every detail of the file. Amateur sleuths created timelines, debated theories, compared notes. For many, Joseph's case was their introduction to the world of cold case research. Entire communities of strangers, scattered across the globe, united in their determination to bring him justice. The cultural impact was not without controversy. Some criticized the way Joseph's image was used, arguing that his suffering was too often sensationalized. Others worried that folklore and ghost stories trivialized his tragedy. Yet even these debates were evidence of his lasting resonance. People cared enough to argue, to protect his dignity, to ensure his memory was treated with respect. In the end, Joseph Augustus Zarelli's story became one of the most enduring unsolved cases in American history, not only because of the mystery itself, but because of the way it touched so many lives. He inspired journalism, art, folklore, activism. He became a symbol of the failures of the past and the persistence of those who refused to let him vanish. And now, with his name restored, Joseph's cultural presence continues. No longer a faceless boy, he is remembered as who he truly was. Yet the mystery, the lingering absence of accountability, ensures that his story will continue to echo in memory and media alike. The boy in the box is no longer nameless, but he remains timeless, a reminder of how one child's life, lost too soon, can shape the conscience of a city and a nation. And so, after all these words, after all these years, after all the lies that have brushed against his story, we come to the quiet end of our journey through the case of the boy in the box. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. It is a story that begins with silence, with a child who had no name, no voice, no one to speak for him. It carried on through decades of unanswered questions, through the tireless work of detectives and strangers who refused to let him be forgotten. It wound its way through folklore, through books and television, through the imaginations of those who were haunted by the photograph of a little boy whose short life ended in tragedy. And at last, in 2022, it reached a turning point. Joseph was given back his name. He was no longer unknown. He was no longer only the boy in the box. He was Joseph, a boy who had lived, who had smiled, who had belonged to a family, even if they had not stood for him when it mattered most. And yet, the case is not closed. His death remains unsolved. His story remains unfinished. While we have gained an identity, we still lack in justice. But perhaps, in another sense, Joseph has already achieved something profound. He has endured. For 65 years, strangers carried his memory when those closest to him did not. For 65 years, people left flowers at his grave, whispered his story to their children, reminded the world that every child deserves to be seen, to be loved, to be protected. As we close this long retelling, let us sit for a moment with the quiet. Let us imagine the Philadelphia of 1957, the cold winter woods, the box that held more than just a child's body. It held the weight of a mystery that would last generations. And then let us shift forward to today, where his name is known, where people still gather at his resting place, where detectives still work the case, and where his story is told again, not for fear or spectacle, but for remembrance. This is the moment where our story comes to a close. Thank you for listening to the story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, once known only as the boy in a box. If this story has held you, if it has carried you gently into thought or into sleep, then perhaps it has done what it was meant to do, to remind us, softly, that even in mystery, there can be meaning. Feel free to find more capturing stories from the True Crime for Sleep series here on this channel. Until next time, rest well and good night.